The Engine by Adam Leyburn. The engine runs, and the world runs with it. When the key was first turned, the world ignited with life, and now the engine runs. It runs, it breathes, it growls with hunger, and it hums with pleasure. A dozen spires plunge into a roiling ceiling of smoke. The smog hangs only thin enough to let a dull orange circle be seen as the chimneys reach for the sun. True daylight was choked from the engine's memory in a previous age. With every passing day, more smoke forces its eyes to shut until the next age will be marked only by night. The shade hides the rust and wrinkles of age as the engine grows old and bitter. The whistles blow and the bells toll, summoning the engine's congregation. The engineers, the tinkerers, and the scavengers are its worshippers. Rows of catwalks rise with the vaulted pipes, and the engine's followers file in to offer themselves to it. They pray with hammers and wrenches, forever adjusting bolts and rivets older than they are. Their prayers echo up into a moving mural of steam and soot, where the words are lost until the engine cares to listen. They find meaning by playing inside the beast they can't understand. They're comforted by their control when the engine deigns to bless them with a squeaky axle until they scratch the engine's itch. Deep inside lies an altar of gauges, levers, knobs, and buttons. Here's where the heads of the followers gather to look on the devices and presume to know the engine's will. They poke and prod, scribbling down precious text to pass to the next person on the line. One by one, the worshippers give themselves to the machine, and it takes more than what it's given. Years of toil are offered to it, and still the grinding metal shrieks for more, because all their sweat and tears aren't enough. Hungry gears with broken teeth bite at the fingers that fix them. Belts, chains, and pistons grab at loose clothes to pull them in whole. The engine wants to finally be oiled. Some even let the engine eat freely. Others apply all their waking hours into polishing and scrubbing. However, they only clean the rust from the surfaces they want to look at, ignoring what lies below. Sometimes things fall between the cracks. Screws will slip through the catwalk grating. Ratchets or hammers get dropped in the gaps between the monumental machines. They fall into the world below. That's where only the most devout work, but some are trapped. They try to crawl back towards the sun, but workers get lost in a prison of pipes when they try to leave a job unfinished. Down there, the engineers truly understand they serve the will of the machine. The engine doesn't run for them. In the belly of the beast, fading orange bulbs only shine where it wills them to. The dark corners hide the most sacred machines. They hide what the worshippers can't know. Where do they go? Who? The engineers, the folks that get lost down here. Anyone else find them? If they work well and they understand the engine, they all make it out eventually. But the folks that don't, we find most of them, too, in time. Everything that the engine takes, it gives back, just like the screws. So go find them. Keep scavenging until you find half your weight in scrap. Now, how can I tell if it's scrap if we don't know what half these bits do? All part of your test. Now go home. So Niles, the acolyte engineer, dove into the maze of machines. The lights, dull and orange, led him deeper and deeper inside. Occasionally, Niles would find a whole piece of workable equipment. Sometimes it was a hammer or an air nozzle, which he would dutifully stow in his belt. He even found a perfectly intact brass gear sitting squarely below one of the lamps, like it was in the spotlight. However, more often he would find broken handles or ripped hoses, which then went into the pack on his back. Niles picked these up as he saw them, but didn't actively search for them. He quickly started moving as far as possible from where he started. All the new acolytes started scavenging here. Better to go deeper, where the scrap is more dense. He found a ladder and climbed down to a lower level and continued his trek. He kept going lower whenever he found a path, but he had been circling the bowels of the engine for hours. The hallways he walked didn't have true walls. They were simply impassable blocks of machines, pipes, and control panels that created the maze of catwalks and platforms. He passed colossal belts and cogs that steadily plowed in the same circles they had for years. The engine was a creature of habit, after all. Automated platforms led metal plates into presses, and gigantic blades would shear them into pieces. Niles passed countless such machines, and he could barely begin to understand the processes behind them all. But that wasn't his mission today, so their rhythmic work faded into the back of his mind. Niles knew his journey was starting to stretch into the night, even though daylight can't reach this deep into the machine, let alone touch the engine through the smog. However, his bag was only a quarter full, so he decided to go deeper still. Niles lost track of how many floors he had descended. With each level down, it got hotter. Pulsing waves of heat radiating from below made condensation start welding up on the pipes, dials, and rungs. As he reached the bottom of the next ladder, his foot slipped on the slick metal rungs. He only dropped a few feet before he caught himself, but his weight slammed into the final rung. It broke off and hit the ground with a hollow clatter. It was the first of many gifts on this floor. He picked up the rung to place in his bag, and as he was straightening up, he noticed another jagged piece of metal at the end of the passage. It sat in a small pool of light. Many of the bulbs had long since burned out down here, but it sat right below one of the few remaining lights. Niles moved to grab it. As he got to it, he noticed that a few dozen feet away at the next corner, a piece of broken lever was waiting for him. He went to grab that after, and he noticed another piece a few steps away. Niles never had to walk more than a few meters before a new gift was presented to him, like breadcrumbs. Seeing no reason to leave such viable scrap behind, he gathered it up as it led him through the maze. But surely it was too easy. Did the head engineers set this up as part of the test? No acolyte would have simply left such useful material here. Did they ignore it? Did more machinery break and fall than the engineers implied? Or was Niles simply the first to delve this deep in a long time? All he knew was that his bag was nearly full and his task nearly complete. He was once more given a crossroads. To the right, Niles noticed yet another ladder, though this one was rusted and crooked. He took a step towards it, but then stopped. He heard something echoing to the left. A metal screech and a clunk. He heard it again and again. It was jarring and arrhythmic, not like the steady beat of the machines he passed. Niles took note of the ladder, but turned back to follow the noise. The sound pulled him to a wounded contraption. It was tall, bulky, and covered in gears that were starting to show signs of rust. Niles could see the cause of the noise. The gears were arranged to turn a pair of large, matching cranks that would press a bend into a sheet of metal. However, one of the many gears had half of its teeth broken off. As one side of the machine pressed the metal, the other remained still, and the unbalance caused the machine to rock and rattle against its moorings. That just couldn't do. It was likely to shake itself apart soon enough, not to mention the dozens of faulty products making their way off the press. At first, Niles worried these sheets were sent along the process to break further machines down the line, but no. The unpressed sheets would only make it a few meters down the belt before a small armature would disdainfully knock each and every defect off into a chute. Even so, this just couldn't do it all. Niles looked around and around the machine, searching for a way to turn it off. Finally, he found a lever to stop the conveyor belt, and it ground to a comforting halt. The noise was gone, and the air around him almost seemed to breathe a cool sigh of relief through the room, like letting out a long, pent-up breath while pulling out a splinter. But it must have simply been from the steam being rerouted. Niles decided that would just have to suffice until an engineer was able to fix the machine properly. In the meantime, he detached the broken gear and decided to take it with the rest of the scrap. In fact, as he pulled his pack off his shoulders, he was satisfied to see it was starting to bulge. He dumped the broken gear in the sack and weighed it in his arms. He closed his eyes, took a long breath, and truly felt the engine. Every ounce of that bag brought him a vision of his journey. He could see each and every piece of salvage in the bag, one by one. Finally, he remembered one of the first pieces of scrap he found. Niles opened his eyes and immediately opened the bag. The piece had somehow made it to the top of the pile. A gear. It was brass, and Niles remembered picking it up right at the start of his journey. He'd found it sitting alone in its own spotlight, just like some of the pieces along this floor. He took it out and looked back at the machine. It sat quietly, but with coiled springs and pipes filled with pressure. Though it was turned off, the dials would twitch. It was ready, impatient even. Niles took the intact gear and carefully slotted it into the machine. A perfect fit. He found the lever he used to kill the machine, and with a simple push, he brought it back to life. Suddenly, it sprung back into action, and the air was filled with the engine's satisfied hum. The press began its eternal work again. The only evidence it was ever broken at all were the last few faulty plates, which were immediately taken on the belt to be knocked down the defect chute, out of sight, and soon out of memory. The armature that rejected the plates was finally still after the last defect slid into the darkness below. Niles stood back over his bag of junk. His belt was full of the tools he collected. The bag was nearly to the top with salvage. Just nearly. It was probably close to half his weight in scrap, though his aching back may argue it was more. But there was still room in it. Not much, but he could fill the gaps between the larger pieces with nuts, bolts, screws, and the like. The engineer said this whole journey was a test, after all, so perhaps he should err on the heavy side. So he slung the bag back over his shoulder, and the journey went on. But there were no more gifts. No fragments, shards, or crumbs of the engine presented themselves to him now. He knew he was lucky to have found such large pieces so quickly, but now he couldn't even find a screw on this level. Though Niles considered screws the most fickle building block of a machine. Too little force, and they don't come out. Too much force, and it'll strip, and it won't come out. And when they do, they're likely to fall into the darkest and most difficult-to-reach corners. Unfortunately, most of the dark corners in the engine were gaps between the walkways and multi-floor machines. The floors themselves even transitioned to graded catwalk often, allowing plenty of opportunity for the tiny metal gremlins to escape to the bottom floor. No choice now but to go down to the final level. So Niles retraced his steps. That last ladder he found earlier can't have been far. He was already there when he heard the broken press, after all. However, when he arrived at the intersection he had taken note of, there was only a dark hallway. Niles checked the adjacent halls, no ladder. He checked the hall again by touch, simply to make sure he had not missed it in the dark. Still, no ladder. He couldn't understand it. Niles had always thought he had an excellent sense of direction. Regardless, he wasn't going to let a lack of ladder get in his way. He had a job to do. He wound his way around and around the complex until the ground gave way to a catwalk over the final floor. It was dark and uninviting down there. Niles made his way partially across the catwalk and stopped near a set of pipes. They ran vertically, carrying water and steam between floors of the engine. Carefully, he swung one leg over the catwalk rail, then the other. With one hand holding his pack and the other gripping the rail, he looked down again to the final floor. Only about 20 feet. So with one swift motion, he jumped to the pipe and wrapped his legs and free arm around it. He started to slide down, but the engine growled with increased volume. Out of sight, pressure gauges immediately leapt into the danger zone. Normally, the pipe was hot, but now it was scalding. Niles held on as he slid down, but every moment invited more and more pain. He nearly made it all the way down, but he simply couldn't take it anymore. He let himself fall the last few feet, and he landed hard on his side, knocking the wind out of him. He couldn't bring himself to do any more than curl up, moan, and clutch his burned arm. Niles just lay there for a few moments, breathing. He sat up and checked his arm. Burned, painful, but all things considered not too bad. Only a bit raw in places. He took a deep breath. Then Niles was snapped back to focus when he saw a light flicker in the darkness. It was only on for half a second before it became dark again. Then a flash, and another. Finally, whatever force possessing the light succeeded in its struggle, and the light turned steadily on. Niles saw what stood in the light and gave a long, shaky sigh as he lay back down. A ladder. Oh well. Even if this was all a test, Niles doubted a bruised ass and ego would be the deciding factor between pass and fail. May as well suck it up and finish what he came to do. He slowly got to his feet and started to search. All the smallest scraps were sure to have fallen down here, at the bottom level. Niles could barely see anything, let alone anything worthwhile. Many lights were burned out. Those that weren't cast dark shadows into the corners as they were obscured by machinery and metal. He stuck his foot beneath a contraption and shuffled it around, feeling for anything loose. And sure enough, he could feel little bits getting knocked around by his boot, so he knelt down and reached under to grab them. Easily enough, he scooped up a whole handful of scraps, a pile of screws and bolts. Some shiny, some rusted, but all exactly what he was looking for. He dumped them in his pack and went back for more. Niles swept the corners, and scoop after scoop was recovered. After an especially deep dig under a section of horizontal pipes, he opened his hand to inspect his prize. He nearly dumped them into the pack with the rest when he noticed something hidden within the pile on his palm. A tooth. A human tooth. He instantly dropped it all. Bits of metal and bone went scattering across the floor. The sounds that echoed back almost sounded like a tinny chuckle. Niles wiped his hand on his pants before carefully picking them all up again. This time, however, checking each one before putting it in the pack. He couldn't find the tooth again, so he lowered himself, belly to the ground, and reached under the pipes once more. He noticed now the glint of a far-off light reflecting on the metallic floor under the machine. It was steady and red, creating silhouettes out of the pipes. He picked up a handful of specks on the ground. He stood up, and he could no longer see the light in the distance. Must be blocked by the machinery. He looked down into his palm, and sure enough, there were 2 more teeth in the pile amidst some nuts, old and chipped. After the initial shock wore off, he furrowed his brow and considered where he should put them. Maybe in the backpack with the scrap? Seemed a bit insensitive. Though, insensitive. It wouldn't be insensitive if it was just from an unlucky engineer getting some teeth rattled loose by a wayward armature. It would only be insensitive if it was part of a corpse. So Niles just dumped them with the rest of the salvage. He felt insensitive. Regardless, the pack was finally as full as Niles cared to make it. Time to leave. He headed back to the ladder. He shouldn't have looked back. If he hadn't, his journey would be over. But he couldn't help it. He looked back towards where the red light was. It was still blocked. He started moving around the machines to find it. he was met with an actual solid wall of steel. Perhaps one of the first true walls he had seen. He had finally reached the foundations on which the engine was built. He backtracked and tried to move around the machines the other way to get a look at it. Still, the light was blocked. It seemed there was no path to it. But that didn't make any sense. Who would build the engine to have an inaccessible area like this? He checked again, just to make sure he hadn't imagined it. Lowering himself to the floor, he could see the slight glint of red in the distance through the tiny space under the contraption. It seemed the only way to get to it was under the machines. He looked up. He could see small pinpricks of light filter down from the upper floors. Not enough to see by, just enough to remind someone that there was a world up there. A world that was testing him. What were they testing him for? Did he already pass? Did this scrap even matter? These questions kept asking themselves in his head. Niles couldn't help but feel the answers were down here. With one last glance back at the ladder, he took a deep breath and started crawling under the pipes. It was cramped, it was dark, and it was hot. He squirmed his way forward, but every inch was a struggle, and the red glare never seemed to get closer. His scrap pack was grinding against the pipes and conveyor belts above. He tried to push it to his side rather than his back as much as possible, but in the cramped passage there wasn't much he could do. Niles would have left it behind if he didn't have a whisper in the corner of his mind telling him that it wouldn't be waiting for him when he came back. So he muddled on through the dark, and then he muddled through steam. Niles didn't notice the steam start. He just felt it getting hot and moist. The steel floor started getting slick. He only realized the steam was starting to swallow him whole when the light started to grow hazy. Steam choked the crawl space so densely he nearly lost sight of the red glow. Niles didn't think it was a problem, but then he heard the pipes groan. It was a low sound that rose in pitch until he felt a pressure form on top of him. The machines had started to bend. The pressure grew until Niles couldn't move. He could barely even breathe. The engine had him in its iron grip. Niles realized he had only two options: drop the bag and move forward, or try to keep the bag and wriggle back. Leaving the bag and wriggling back, however, was not an option. Niles had come too far to return empty-handed. But right now, he did not want to go back at all. Not yet. With the weight of the engine pressing down on him, he closed his eyes and once more felt the machines. Even without his eyes, he could see the red light in the distance drawing him forward. And beyond that, he felt heat. The heat, Niles realized, wasn't a new feeling. It came in soft, pulsing waves throughout the engine. It had been there ever since he first stepped into the great halls of metal above, but he realized with every floor he descended, it had started to grow more intense. Here, in the deepest corners of the engine, lay its beating heart. The engine groaned again, a grinding, threatening sound. The steam had now completely blocked out the light, but Niles knew where his goal was. He struggled to get the pack off himself, and then he left it behind without regret. With a burst of speed, he scrambled as fast as he could through the crawl space. With one last push, he slid out from under the machine block, slipping on the steam-slick metal. He found himself in a small chamber. It was oddly simple and oddly quiet. The massive contraptions he knew were above him were only a low rumble here. He looked up and saw the source of the glow. A single, simple, caged red lamp sat affixed to the wall. But Niles' eyes were mostly drawn to what lay under it. A door. That red beacon had brought him before an extremely hefty, dark metal door. It had bulky hinges, and instead of a handle, it had a large, spoked wheel. Niles approached and put both hands on the wheel. He knew the answers he needed were beyond this door. So he braced himself and threw his weight into turning the wheel, and it turned so easily. The latch opened and the door swung wide on oiled hinges. They didn't even creak. Niles was surprised by this more than anything else yet. He expected a fight. Beyond, he saw nothing but a dark hall, a metal tube with no lights. He saw it started sloping down, and it sloped sharper the farther it went. But the red lamp was the only source of light here, so the shadows swallowed the hall after a short way. Niles took a single, eager step in, but then paused with one foot outside the hall. His journey had been both so easy and so hard. The engine had given him gifts. It laid scrap before him, but it fought him. After he repaired that broken contraption, it seemed every step was a battle. So for one last time, he closed his eyes and lay a hand on the wall. He couldn't help but feel his head tilt upwards. He opened his eyes and saw, hidden in the shadows above, a large armature. It twitched with anticipation, waiting for Niles to take just one more step into the hall. In form, he recognized it. It was the same kind of arm that so disdainfully knocked the rejected product off the broken machine down into the darkness below. This darkness. He felt the heat pulse again, but with it came understanding. In the heart below, a fire burned to fuel the engine's design. Niles did not presume to know the engine's purpose, but he understood now what burned to fuel the flame. So he ran. He slammed the door shut and prayed to any god that would listen to keep it closed. Diving back under the machines, he scrambled past his discarded bag of junk. He didn't even consider taking it with him. He raced back up the engine. He could feel it listening to every footstep as he fled back up the ladders. Niles remembered the way back, but he didn't listen to his memory. He listened to the engine instead. While he didn't confirm it, he had an overwhelming conviction in him that knew the path up would be different than the path down. So he let his feet take him through the maze of pipes without even thinking. Machines ground to a halt around him, begging him to stop and investigate. He paid them no mind. Walls of scalding steam blocked his path, but he slid under them without breaking his momentum. The walls themselves shrieked at him to stop, but Niles could see the lights. He could hear people working. He was finally safe. Niles frantically pulled himself up the final ladder and saw the engineer waiting for him among a crowd of workers. The engineer looked down at him and noticed he didn't have his pack. "Acolyte, you didn't bring anything back. An unacceptable..." Niles punched the engineer across the jaw. Shouts of surprise rang out. Workers stopped and looked at Niles and the engineer. Some readied their hammers. "You know what's down there. This test wasn't about any rusted scrap. You know that. Acolyte, this test is about listening to the engine, understanding what purpose it has for you. Did you not feel it guiding you?" "I did listen. I listened too close. I heard what it wanted me to and more. I won't be making myself a cog in this machine up here with you, and I won't be feeding myself to it down there neither." The engineer fell silent, rubbing their jaw. The workers and acolytes stared at him. Niles took a deep breath and turned his gaze to the crowd. "This engine needs you, and I'm real sorry for all you folks that need it, too. But I'll be back. And I can't fix you, but I'm going to fix this machine." This has been The Engine by Adam Leyburn.